Hello, and this is a Knight's Chronicle guide to the Erandel Advent, the new Apocalypse 5-star Advent. She's a support. Uh, Fairly decent, but that's a topic for another day. I'm not too keen on her. Uh, this is an Apocalypse guide, so things will be slightly different if you're doing the lower difficulty. Um, Here's the team composition. We have Aurora as lead for her incredible damage over time, damage increase to enemies affected by damage over time of 70%. It's a very strong, very good leader ability. She herself, even though she gets an 80% attack bonus in this advent, she does pathetically low damage, to put it bluntly. Her main purpose in this advent is to maintain researcher buff, to decrease the enemy counterattack chance by 50%. Now, while this wording here seems to make it appear that she'll gain the researcher buff anytime she attacks an enemy with a damage over time effect on them, it is in fact tied to this 50% chance to cooldown. She will not get the researcher buff if this 50% chance to decrease the cooldown also activates. So it's essentially 50% to refresh the researcher buff anytime she attacks into a enemy affected by damage over time. She has her skill 3, which will give her the researcher buff, and it's a good way to get it if no enemy is affected by damage over time, or in the beginning when you have all your cooldowns. Maintaining this research buff is pretty much key, especially in the third wave, to prevent the counterattacks from just completely decimating your team. To that end, we have both Ramu and Sid with poison runes, so that when they attack, they have a chance of putting a dot onto the enemy. Ramu, because she's hybrid, also has access to this, which is flowing poison, chance to poison an enemy when she uses her skill 2, and also Nerve Strike, which has a 50% chance to shock an enemy when using her skill 1. Multi-strike and counterattack, pretty much standard rune setup for supports and things of that nature. Sid is more or less the same. High multi-strike, high counterattack, and also with the poison. Ruby, you want preferably an awakened Ruby, just so that she has multiple chances to go and do damage with as many skill ups as possible. This one, mine is currently maxed out, which helps immensely. If you don't have an awakened Ruby, you can use a friend's awakened Ruby and slot in another DPS in here. Someone perhaps like Wendy, who has the Great S2 buff, strike preparation buff, and increase to single target attacks. And she herself does fairly good damage. She can do fairly good damage herself. Elizabeth is also really good, especially if she's awakened. She can reliably and consistently land her Phantom Crow damage over time debuff, which will help Aurora always have a target that can potentially refresh her researcher buff. For the friend slot, there are several options. You can bring in another Awakened Ruby. You can bring in another Aurora. This helps having researcher buff up at all times, since you have two characters that can potentially get it by attacking into damage over time, or just spacing out their skill 3s strategically so that it's up on at least one character at all times. This is recommended if you have a fairly beefy Awakened Ruby yourself. Something like at least a max skill 3, preferably a max skill 2. Skill 1, while helpful, isn't uh, required, but um, obviously it helps when she's more or less your only DPS in this advent, since even with the 80% attack buff, Aurora will not be doing a whole lot of damage. In fact, she does pretty much about the same amount of damage as Ramuh and Sid in this advent for me. I'm most comfortable with using double awakened rubies, but it's up to personal preference. I think it's probably faster with double awakened ruby, but more consistent with double Aurora, just because you have that flexibility in the researcher buff. With that, we'll just hop right into it. I've used Miku's ruby before. She's a 266 with all PvE talents. Sid is more or less like his Advent, except this time he's a wind element. Every time he spawns his clone, he has a chance to stun a character, but Ramuh's costume gives you a blanket 30% chance immunity, so this time it procced and no one got stunned. Anytime you kill a clone, it will remove one debuff from your entire party, so it's a good way to remove the stun if it's a key character, such as a Ruby that got stunned. On the other hand, you can wait until he does his AoE mental seal attack and then kill the clone so that it clears the mental seal from all your characters. Other than that, it's basically just a DPS push into Sid. Just push as much damage into him as possible. Hopefully get some multi-strikes and some extra turns, but unfortunately we are not that lucky. And of course everyone got more or less mental sealed. Oof. We'll use Ramuh's S2 to heal up and remove the mental seals. And then just fairly straightforward. And push your damage. Sid's S2 is pretty important for the cooldown reduction. You want to be doing it on these three characters, just so Ramuh can have her S2 ready, since it's very good for clearing debuffs, since it lowers debuff duration by 1 turn, and also for allowing Aurora to use her S3 as quickly as possible if she gets unlucky, like there, where she does not get the refresh the researcher buff. After the bosses hit about 50%, they have the revenge buff, where anybody attacking into him has a chance to be weakened, just like the Sid here, which I just cleared. Which can essentially is a death sentence if they get attacked while that debuff is on, since it lowers your maximum HP about to 10%. I think we can finish him off or be very close to it. There we go. Other than that, fairly straightforward. Kill the clones when you need to clear some status elements on your party, and then just push as much damage into Sid as possible, as quickly as possible. Nicholas, his mechanic is when he S3s and he has any phantoms still alive, he does greatly increased damage. Even if he has just one phantom alive and he does his ultimate, it can be enough to wipe out 2 to 3 of your characters. It does a pretty significant amount of damage. So clearing out the phantoms as quickly as possible is important here. Just like the other Sid wave, anytime you clear a clone, it will remove 1 debuff from your entire party. There's nothing strategic about doing that here, really. The blinds are annoying, the optical illusions are very annoying, but you have to be killing the phantoms just ASAP so that when he does ultimate, which will be his next turn, he'll do a summon, he'll do normal attacks which has chance to blind, an optical illusion, and then he'll do his shadow form and immediately go into his ultimate. So you have to be able to clear the phantoms by that time, or else you'll be using your reses, which if you have to do that too many times, it gets pretty dicey when you have no DPS. Because like I said, Aurora herself does very little to almost no damage in this advent. Like the other one, when he gets below 50-ish%, he'll also have that revenge. You'll see it. There'll be a message pop up saying that he's in the next stage, and you'll see the buff there. She's optical illusion, so she's gonna miss. But she still has one turn left, so I can just wait until next turn and use her skill 3. And that's the problem with the weakens. It's gonna just completely kill your party. That's why both Sid and Ramu are really good, since they can res multiple people with their reses. And it's still gonna die. So that was a fairly sloppy stage 2, but it happens. That's just the RNG with the weekend and the turn order of the characters and everything. For stage 3, it's more or less the same mechanic, except instead of removing a debuff on your characters when you kill them, instead they grant a debuff immunity to all your characters. That plays a pretty key role, because as you just saw, when she does her summon, she weapon corrodes your characters, which just greatly reduces your damage to pathetic amounts. It's not so bad if any of these characters, these 3, Aurora, Sid, or Ramu, get weapon corroded, but if your rubies get weapon corroded and then they get their multiple turns proccing while still weapon corroded, you lose so much damage. So it's pretty important to try to juggle getting the debuff immunity at the same time pushing damage into Erandel herself. Here we just want to be pushing some damage into her. And probably the multi-strikes will clear one of the... Try to land a dot on her so that we get the increased damage leader ability. And Sid with his cooldown reduction. See there, she did her ultimate, but because the rubies had the debuff immunity from killing the previous clone, they were not affected, meaning we can push a lot of damage into Erandel herself. And we had the refresh on the researcher buff, and like the others, below 50% she gets that revenge buff, which means your characters has a chance to get weakened if you attack into her. But if you have that debuff immunity buff from killing one of her clones, you can attack into her very safely without fear of being weakened. And we had Erandel refresh the buff. Didn't quite clear. Now this is more or less the ideal situation when you push her into her next revive phase. Basically, she'll revive twice, so you have to kill her 3 times. She has 3 health bars. When she dies, any of the previous lives summons she has will be killed by her, and then she'll summon new ones. But at the same time she summons them, she'll do a weapon corrosion on all of your units. But because she killed the previous Phantoms, it'll grant a debuff immunity to all your characters, making you immune to the weapon corrosion, allowing you to do normal damage when your DPS's turns come. For this, however, I'm going to remove Ruby's Weaken, and then push her into the next phase with Sid. And you saw the immunities from the weapon corrosion there. And then for now, we'll try to push some damage into Erandel. Oh, there we go. Oh, yeah, some counters. Down on Erandel would be very nice to get the increased damage. Aurora, attack into this one, try to get the researcher buff. Nope. Didn't happen. Oof. S3, get the research buff. Get the cooldown. Maybe we can get her on the counter? No. That weapon corrosion buff is pretty brutal. Get our other DPS up, and no damage over time to try to refresh. Clear that weaken buff even though he was poisoned, or Ruby was poisoned. Other than that, it's fairly straightforward. Maintaining the researcher buff on Erandel is really important. That's why I said double Erandel is probably a lot more consistent. Double Awakened Ruby is faster. It's gonna be really rough with the counterattacks. Especially when she's fairly close to being pushed over to begin weakening. Yeah, now she's gonna start weakening. Oof. Some really bad RNG there. I don't want to attack into her because she's gonna counter. And finally we got the researcher buff. But we're weapon corroded and this is actually fairly bad for the final stage. Taunted, can clear that. Fill up and try to do some damage, maybe. Nah. Weapon corroded, but we should be able to do this. And there's that. It's a bit RNG, but not too bad if you have the right units and the right runes and the right talents and things like that. So that is the Apocalypse Erandel Advent. Good luck clearing it. I hope this helped.